All right, so, we've got this stack of readings here on economic development, and I'm looking for some key insights, some key takeaways to help me understand why some nations succeed and why others fail. And this has baffled people, I think, for centuries.
Yeah.
But you've highlighted Why Nations Fail by Daron, Acemoglu, and Jim Robinson as a potential source of answers. And I've got to say, their premise is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it's a really...
They argue that it's not geography or disease or even culture that ultimately determines a nation's fate.
It all comes down to institutions.
Institutions, so not just like banks and businesses, right?
Right. Think of institutions more as the rules of the game.
Okay.
The laws, the political systems.
Okay.
How power is distributed, who has a say.
Okay.
Those sorts of things determine how people can participate in shaping their own economic lives.
Okay, so I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. But how can we tell if a nation's institutions are helping or hindering its progress?
Well, Acemoglu and Robinson, they break it down into two main categories.
Okay.
Inclusive institutions and extractive institutions.
Okay, well, let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
What makes an institution inclusive?
So an inclusive institution is one where a broad cross-section of society is empowered. Everyone has a voice. People can participate in the markets.
Right.
They know that their property rights are going to be protected.
Okay.
The U.S., despite its flaws, has historically had elements of this.
Okay. So you're saying inclusive institutions, they kind of level the playing field.
Yeah.
Give everyone a shot based on, their merit and their effort.
Precisely.
And the opposite of that then would be extractive.
Extractive institutions, yeah.
Where power and wealth are concentrated
in
the hands of a small elite.
In the hands of just a few.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So we're talking about systems that are really rigged against the majority of people.
Right.
Is there a real-world example that kind of illustrates this contrast?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Between the two?
Probably the most striking example is the two cities of Nogales.
Okay.
Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora.
Okay, I've heard of this.
In Mexico.
Yeah.
Literally separated by a fence line.
Whoa.
They share the same geography, same culture, same people.
That's incredible.
But drastically different levels of prosperity.
So you're telling me that just a fence line can make such a huge difference in people's lives?
That's the point they're trying to make, is that institutions really matter. That Nogales, Arizona benefits from the relatively inclusive institutions of the United States, whereas Nogales, Sonora grapples with the more extractive institutions that have been more prevalent in Mexico.
Wow, that's a powerful example.
Yeah.
It makes you think about those other factors we often blame for nation struggles, like geography. I don't know how many times I've heard the argument that tropical countries are just destined to be poor because of their climate. Acemoglu and Robinson debunk that, don't they?
Yeah, they point out that before European colonization,
right,
some of the richest civilizations, the Aztecs, the Incas, thrived in tropical regions.
So it's not the heat or the humidity holding them back?
Right.
It makes you wonder, how quickly we jump to these conclusions about what determines a nation's success.
Exactly. They even tackle the culture argument head on.
Yeah, the whole idea that some cultures are just inherently better suited to success than others.
Right, like the Protestant work ethic, for example.
Right.
But that doesn't hold up when you consider examples like North and South Korea.
Yeah, they share the same cultural heritage.
Exactly.
But they've had vastly different economic trajectories.
Right, and the difference is institutions.
Because of the different institutions.
They were put in place after the Korean War.
Right. That's really fascinating.
Yeah, it throws a wrench in those simple explanations.
It really makes you question those assumptions, doesn't it?
It does.
So institutions are crucial, but how do they actually influence a nation's trajectory? I mean, is it just a slow, steady process? Or are there moments that can dramatically shift the course of a nation's history?
That's where the concept of critical junctures comes in.
Okay.
Think of them as pivotal historical moments that can set a nation on a very different path.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
Take the Black Death in Europe.
Okay.
You might think a devastating plague would have the same effect everywhere.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the case at all.
The Black Death, okay, I'm picturing mass chaos. I'm picturing suffering across the board. How could the effects be so different?
Well, it really depended on what institutions were in place before the plague hit.
Okay.
So in Western Europe, where peasants had a bit more autonomy, the Black Death actually weakened feudalism.
Wait a minute. So you're saying a devastating plague led to more freedom?
Yeah, in a sense, because think about it,
Right.
with a dramatically reduced workforce, the surviving peasants had more bargaining power.
Right.
They could demand higher wages, better...
Atlantic trade, yeah, I remember learning about that. The age of exploration, the scramble for colonies. Seemed like everyone was trying to get a piece of the action.
Everyone wanted in on the action, but again, even though this was a global phenomenon, the impact varied greatly depending on the institutions.
Okay, give me an example.
Of the nations involved. So let's compare England and Spain.
Okay.
Both were major players in the Atlantic trade, but they had very different institutional setups.
Okay.
In England, the rise of Atlantic trade empowered a new class of merchants.
Okay.
These merchants, they had newfound wealth and influence.
Okay.
And they were able to challenge the power of the crown.
So they weren't content with just playing by the old rules.
Exactly.
They wanted a seat at the table.
They wanted a voice.
Yeah.
And this clash ultimately led to the Glorious Revolution.
Okay.
A pivotal event that established a more inclusive political system.
So in a way, you could say that the Atlantic trade set the stage
in England
for greater political freedom.
Yeah.
And more inclusive institutions in England.
Precisely. Now contrast that with Spain.
Okay.
The Spanish monarchy, they maintained a much tighter grip on Atlantic trade.
Okay.
They used it to enrich themselves and their allies.
So they doubled down on that extractive approach.
They did.
Did that strategy pay off for them in the long run?
Not really. While Spain initially benefited from all that gold and silver coming in from the colonies, that wealth wasn't reinvested in ways that would benefit the broader economy.
So it was really concentrated at the top.
It was, and as a result, innovation was stifled. Spain eventually fell behind.
Wow. So we see that theme emerging again. Extractive institutions hindering long-term growth.
Yeah.
But can nations escape this vicious cycle?
It's a good question.
I mean, can they shift from extractive to inclusive institutions?
That's the hope, but it's not easy.
Once those patterns have taken root.
Right. Acemoglu and Robinson, they talk about this vicious circle to explain how extractive institutions tend to perpetuate themselves.
So it's like this self-reinforcing loop.
It is.
That makes it even harder to break free. How does that play out in the real world? Can you give me an example?
Sure. Sierra Leone is a really heartbreaking example.
Yeah.
You know, despite being rich in natural resources, it's been plagued by poverty and conflict for decades.
I've heard about Sierra Leone's struggles, but how do extractive institutions fit into that picture?
Well, they're extractive institutions, many of which were inherited from colonialism and then further cemented by post-independence leaders, have created a system where a small elite controls the wealth and the power.
Right.
This concentration of power leads to corruption,
yeah,
lack of investment in public goods,
right,
and ultimately economic stagnation.
It's a tragic example of how those in power can really rig the system,
yeah,
to maintain their dominance, leaving the majority of people trapped in poverty.
Yeah.
It's like modern-day feudalism in a way.
Yeah. It is a pattern that's all too common throughout history, and sadly, it continues to play out in various parts of the world today.
Yeah. It's like you said, it's not a relic of the past. It's a present-day challenge.
It's a present reality for many people.
Yeah. That's a stark reminder of what we're really talking about here.
Yeah, it's high stakes.
Yeah. But why nations fail doesn't leave us completely in despair, right?
No, there's hope.
Is there a way to kind of counter this vicious cycle?
They offer the concept of a virtuous circle.
Okay, a virtuous circle. That sounds a little bit more promising.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
This describes how inclusive institutions, once they're established, can create these positive feedback loops. They reinforce each other and ultimately lead to sustained prosperity.
So it's like building momentum in the right direction.
It is.
Okay.
It creates a system where success breeds more success.
But how do we kickstart that virtuous circle in the first place?
Well, that's the question.
Especially when extractive institutions have been so deeply entrenched.
Yeah, they use the example of the United States to kind of illustrate how this can happen.
Okay. The United States, I wouldn't necessarily think of the U.S. is this perfect model of inclusive institutions.
Right. It's far from perfect.
Given its history. Yeah.
A very complicated history.
Yeah.
But there have been periods where its relatively inclusive institutions have acted as a check against those forces, pushing toward extraction. So you've had this kind of push and pull throughout U.S. history.
Give me an example.
Sure. Think about the late 19th, early 20th centuries. You had the rise of the robber barons, these massive monopolies that posed a real threat to inclusive economic institutions. But the U.S. had these countervailing forces within its political system. So you had people pushing back against these concentrations of power.
So it's like a battle between those who want to rig the game for their own benefit and those who are fighting to keep the playing field level.
Exactly. And those efforts to curb the power of the monopolies, like the trust-busting movement, are a testament to that potential.
The virtuous cycle.
Of the virtuous cycle.
So even in a system that's had, extractive tendencies in the past, there's always that possibility of pushing back and strengthening those inclusive elements.
Yeah. And of course, the U.S. is not immune to those extractive forces.
Of course not, no.
We've seen many instances where they've gained ground.
Especially recently, it seems like.
Yeah, it's an ongoing struggle.
Yeah, this constant tension between inclusivity and extraction.
It's a battle.
It's a battle.
But a battle worth fighting.
Absolutely, and that's where Why Nations Fail, I think, really challenges us, not just as readers, but as citizens, to engage with these issues.
Absolutely. It's not just an academic exercise. It's about understanding the forces that shape our world.
It's fascinating. This push and pull between these two forces, inclusive and extractive. Can any nation achieve a perfect balance? Or
that's the question, isn't it?
Are we always going to be navigating this tension?
Yeah, I don't think Acemoglu and Robinson would claim to have all the answers, but I think what they're suggesting is that understanding these forces and actively trying to promote those inclusive institutions can make a huge difference.
So it's not a guarantee, but it's like tilting the odds in your favor.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like that it's empowering. It's not just about accepting fate.
It's about agency, right?
It's about recognizing that we have the power to shape our own future.
Yeah. And I think that's really what the book is urging us to do. It's not just to be passive observers of history, but to be active participants in shaping those institutions that govern our lives.
Okay, so Why Nations Fail is more than just an academic analysis of economic history. It's like a call to action. It's urging us to engage with these issues and work towards a more just and prosperous world.
I think so. And that's why I think this is so relevant to you. You came to us with all these readings on economic development.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by this question. Why do some countries thrive and why do others struggle?
Yeah.
It's not just an abstract question for me. It's about understanding the forces that shape people's lives.
It's about real people, right?
Yeah.
Including my own.
And I think that's what makes this book so compelling.
Yeah.
It's not just about these abstract theories.
Right.
It's about real people, real struggles, real possibilities for change.
It connects those historical patterns to our present-day realities.
Exactly.
It's not just about learning from the past. It's about applying those lessons to create a better future.
Now, here's something to think about.
Okay.
The book focuses on national institutions.
But have you ever considered how these concepts might apply to smaller scales?
Like, what do you mean?
I mean, like communities, organizations, even families.
That's interesting.
Yeah, could a family exhibit elements of inclusive institutions or extractive institutions?
I mean, I guess so.
Yeah, think about it.
Yeah.
How are decisions made? Are they made collaboratively or is power concentrated in the hands of a few? Are there clear rules and expectations or are things arbitrary and unfair?
Wow, you're right. Those same principles could apply.
Oh.
I never really thought about it that way.
It's like these institutional patterns are woven into the fabric of our lives.
It really makes you realize how powerful these forces can be.
They're everywhere.
Yeah.
Shaping everything.
Yeah, from global economies to our everyday interactions.
Exactly.
Well, this has been a real eye-opener.
Glad to hear it.
It's given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure our listeners feel the same way.
I hope so.
So we've reached the end of our deep dive into Why Nations Fail. I want to thank you for joining me on this journey.
It's been a pleasure.
And I hope our listeners will continue to explore these ideas.
Keep those questions coming.
Read Why Nations Fail. Delve into some other resources.
Absolutely.
Most importantly, engage in conversations.
Talk about it.
About these critical issues.
It's important.
Because creating a more just and prosperous world requires collective understanding and action.
It does.
So until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving to make a positive impact on the world.
Couldn't said it better myself.